Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in our chats with Emily as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are using the Johnson edition and we turned out a poem 476. I meant to have but modest needs. Now, in this poem, by the way, published in 1891, titled A Prayer, we are in many ways back to poem 376. You'll remember this one. Of course I prayed. And did God care? He cared as much as on the air a bird had stamped her foot and cried, "Give me my reason, life I had not had, but for yourself 'twere better charity to leave me in the Adam's tomb, merry and naught and gay and numb, than this smart misery." Now, prayer is going to be a central part of Emily's thinking, especially as it relates to this notion of the Matthew 21:22 passage, and all things whatsoever you shall ask in prayer, believing ye shall receive, end quote. A line that Emily struggled with. She has already used the word prayer in 21 of her previous poems, and she will use it in 38 total poems. Our assumption is that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily is our playlist. And I'm hopeful that you worked through our set of introductory comments where we made the observation that in our Big Five study, the epistemology, ontology, psychology, sociology, theodicy, the question of pain and suffering, that often Emily's theology will be for her a bit of skepticism because of the fact that there is pain in the world and she is going to struggle with how to address that pain. Prayer obviously being one of those. I'm hopeful that as well you've worked through our previous set of poems. We've just finished with 475. If you've done that, then you know that Emily oftentimes will take a biblical passage and she will in some ways kind of dance with it or move with it or challenge it in some way. Some have called this tone of this poem playful. Others not so much. I'm going to leave it to you to decide. This is how she says it. I meant to have but modest needs, such as content and heaven within my income. These could lie, and life and I keep even. But since the last included both, it would suffice my prayer but just for one to stipulate, and grace would grant the pair. And so, upon this wise I prayed, Great Spirit, give to me a heaven, not so large as yours, but large enough for me. A smile suffused Jehovah's face. The cherubim withdrew. Grave saints stole out to look at me and showed their dimples too. I left the place with all my might. I threw my prayer away. The quiet ages picked it up, and judgment twinkled too. That one so honest be extent, it take the tale for true, that whatsoever you shall ask itself be given you. But I, grown shrewder, scan the skies with a suspicious air, as children swindled for the first, all swindlers be, infer. Now I find this poem majestic. It is a remarkable statement in a certain kind of tone that almost seems jocular, almost seems humorous, and yet I'm not so sure. As we have said many times together, Emily can play both sides of that game. She can be humorous, she can be almost childlike playful, but notice in this poem, this is a growing up poem. This is in some ways a coming to terms with the loss of some notion of faith, especially faith in prayer. Now why, we're never told this, and it's always, often the case, not always, but often the case in these poems. We don't know what it is that spurred this on. Hey, note the narrative structure of this poem with I meant, but since, and so, and then on it goes, right, all the way to the end. We'll begin, notice, with I meant to have but not modest needs. In other words, I didn't ask God for much, such as content, right? And heaven within my income. Notice the economic language of this poem. It's quite remarkable. These could lie. I find this a remarkable use of the word lie because, of course, at the end we're going to talk about a child who has been swindled and is no longer so easy to fool. Notice she is suspicious by the end of the poem. She says, these could lie, and life and I keep even. In other words, I'm trying to make a bargain in some way, all right? I'm trying to figure out a way to get what I want. But since the last included both, right, it would suffice my prayer, and again, we're back to 376, Of Course I Pray. Again, 21 poems already have mentioned prayer. A total of 38 will mention prayer. It would suffice my prayer, but just for one to stipulate, and grace would grant the prayer. In other words, okay, so I was looking to try and see if God would at least give me one of the two things that I had hoped for, contentment in heaven, right? In other words, enough, but more than enough. And so, notice the narrative structure, and so, upon the wise I prayed. Then she uses the word Great Spirit, which is interesting because notice the last word again, the last word of the poem is, I'm going to infer something different. Here notice Great Spirit is almost the Native American kind of referencing as opposed to God or Jehovah, as she will sometimes reference it, right? Great Spirit, give to me, and this is her prayer, a heaven, not so, you'll remember, we mentioned this already, that in 135 poems she mentions heaven, a heaven not so large as yours, but large enough for me. In other words, just give me the things I need. I don't need it all, I just need this. Then a smiling deity. A smile suffused Jehovah's face. So again, notice from Great Spirit to Jehovah. We saw Jehovah in 455. Do you guys remember her use of Jehovah in 415? It ran like this. Sunset at night is natural, but sunset on the dawn reverses nature. Master, so midnights do at noon. Eclipses be predicted and science bows them in, but do one face us suddenly, Jehovah's watch is wrong. And when we get to poem 626, we'll play the game this way. Only God detect the sorrow, only God, the Jehovahs, notice plural, are no babblers unto God. God the Son confided, still secure. God the Spirit's honor, just as sure. Notice here, by the way, she'll use Jehovah in 982 and 1748 as well. A smile, she tells us, suffused Jehovah's face. In other words, God smiled at this request. We're told the angels or the cherubim withdrew. I think that's a key word for this poem. The angels kind of walk away. Grave, I think a key word, grave saints stole out to look at me and showed their dimples too. In other words, the saints kind of laughed at her, she imagines, and says, oh, you silly child, making a prayer such as this. So, notice what her response is. I left the place with all my might. I threw my prayer away. Now, this is where I part with some scholars who say this poem is really just humorous. It's kind of silly and funny and humorous. In other words, she's kind of done with this view of theology that says whatever it is that you ask in prayer, you'll get. I think it's an important line, though. I threw my prayer away. Then the quiet ages picked it up, and judgment twinkled too. Even time itself will somehow smirk or laugh at her. That one so honest be extent. I can't believe there was actually somebody who believed in this idea of Matthew 21:22. It take the tale for true. Some have seen this as Emily's blasphemy, and then she quotes but misquotes, as she loves to do, the King James Version 16:11, that whatsoever you shall ask itself be given you, which is of course not exactly the language of the Matthew passage. In other words, Emily likes to quote the biblical text, but to quote it slant, as she'll say in her 1129 poem, tell all the truth but tell it slant. But notice how it finishes. Now, this is the end. I, comma, grown shrewder, dash, scanned the skies. Right, notice the tense change, by the way. Now we're all of a sudden we're in the present tense. With a suspicious air. And then a final simile. As children, dash, swindled for the first, all swindlers be, infer. Of course, her syntax makes you have to read this several times. In other words, fool me once, right, as they say, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And she says, after this experience, I wasn't so ready to just easily believe in this notion that God gives you what you ask for in prayer, feeling swindled in some way. By the way, this inferring we will come to in our next poem study, 477, with estimating of pain. When we get to poem 1751, at the very end of our study together, she'll say it this way. There comes an hour when begging stops, when the long interceding lips perceive their prayer is vain. Thou shalt not is a kinder sword than from a disappointing God. Disciple, call again. Again, Emily's struggle with the theology that she grew up with, I think, is present in so many of these poems. What are we going to do with a poem like this at 2A? Well, the great scholar Wisher actually said it this way, and it's kind of fun to read his take on it. He said it this way, quote, "Could not the victim take the cosmic swindle in good part and even share the cosmic joke? Question mark. I think the point here is that sometimes faith is hard. Sometimes one believes, if only this would happen for me, and then when it doesn't happen, how do you deal with the disappointment? At 2B, again, the tone, I think, is the significant question here. Do you see it as good-natured, or do you see it as and humorous, or do you see it as something more indictive? A statement of, this is why I don't necessarily so easily look to the air and believe. I'm suspicious now. At 3A, well, we mentioned poem 376 and 1751, this idea of Emily's struggle with praying and prayer. Finally, at 3B, to own a poem like this, how do you read this poem in terms of its tone? And what about your dance with prayer, and how do you deal with it? I hope Emily's challenging you. Thank you.